activities that have generated widespread controversies, the things that end up in a lot of other research on other people's parts, symposia, conventions, exchanges of letters in the American Psychologist, all those kinds of things that are supposed to stimulate new creative thinking on the part of all of the rest of us. And that's what I mean by causing trouble. I've decided to introduce them in the opposite order in which they're announced so as to balance things out. So we'll begin with Dr. Orne. I've introduced Martin Orne to this colloquium before, and he's a familiar figure to most of you since he attends the colloquium regularly and is frequently heard from during the question period. He got his bachelor's degree in '49 and his master's in '51 from Harvard. He then proceeded to Tufts for an MD in 1955, and then back to Harvard again for his PhD in 1958. He then taught and did research at Harvard in psychiatry and social relations until 1964, which is, I believe, when you came here. He is now professor and director of the Unit for Experimental Psychiatry. His research has covered many areas, but he's probably best known for his work on hypnosis and on the social psychology of the psychology experiment. His term demand characteristics has become a household word, well, at least in the households of psychology graduate students. Dr. Milgram has spoken to this colloquium before. That was before my time here. He received his BA from Queens College in 1954, and his PhD from Harvard in 1960 in the social relations department, not to be confused with the psychology department at Harvard. You know how my feelings on that would go. In 1960, he went to Yale, where he remained until 1963. He then returned to Harvard as an assistant professor from 63 to 67. He is now professor and director of doctoral studies in social psychology at the City University of New York. His areas of research have included influence processes, cross-cultural studies, and crowd behavior. He has just written a chapter on crowd behavior for the Handbook in Social Psychology, Volume 4, Imminent. Those of you who have been buying those volumes know that they were supposed to be out 2 years ago. 3 are now out. The one he's in is imminent. Not to mention eminent. He's best known, however, for his work on studies of obedience that began in 1964. In fact, usually these studies are now referred to as the Milgram effect. In case someone may have wandered in here from something like cell biology by mistake, I'd like to say briefly that these studies involve having individuals give greater and greater levels of shock, they think that is, to another individual, and noting at what time they refuse to continue under a variety of independent variables. He will speak more on that later in case he thinks I'm not representing it accurately. The first study caused what I would refer to as an ethical flap in Washington. More importantly, I think for us as psychologists, it is the whole area of the ethics of using human beings in research has been stimulated by the work of Milgram, as we've all stopped to think about exactly what are the issues, what are our positions. Of course, his work has also been important theoretically in the area of conformity. Now, it's my understanding that the debate today came about at the request of Professor Milgram, who said he would love to come, but he didn't just want to talk, he wanted to debate with Professor Orne, who, again, as I understand it, accepted with alacrity, having wanted this opportunity for some time. So we will now have the pleasure of seeing and hearing these two gentlemen make trouble for each other, while at the same time allowing us to ponder the question of obedience or demand characteristics. Now, we've got this in the format of a debate, and this is going to be the way we're going to do it. Professor Milgram will discuss for 15 minutes his studies in general. Then Professor Orne will have 15 minutes in which he will talk about how he views these studies. Then, for 10 minutes, Professor Milgram will have a chance to rebut, therefore presenting his view of Professor Orne's view of his studies. And after that, we will have them talk back and forth at each other for periods of no more than 5 minutes and hopefully less. After they've exhausted themselves at that, we'll let you have a chance at them. All right? Does that sound like the way we planned it? Okay. Professor Milgram.
Thank you very much. I don't regard a debate as a battle, actually. I really think of it as an exchange, because it's an intellectual exchange. I think that many things that Dr. Orne has said are extremely stimulating to me. I think many of them are based on a very acute perception, which does not affect most psychologists or social psychologists. It's acute perception, but it leads up to bad judgment, which is quite possible as no jamming, please. It's quite possible as a kind of outcome. And we're not going to discuss the ethical aspects of the experiment. Whenever you undertake a moral experiment, that is one that is rooted in considerations of a moral action, there'll be ethical concern about it. But we're not going to discuss that. We're really going to discuss the interpretation of the experiment. Now, I thought until I came here that there would be a film of the experiment shown this afternoon, so I could dispense with telling you about it. I thought the film gave you a better representation. Just for my own information, could those people who've seen the film indicate to me that they have by raising their hands? I just want to see. Okay, well, about a third of the people have. Well, let me just talk about the experiments very briefly. This isn't part of the debate. It's just giving you the background against which the debate will take place. I wanted to study the circumstances of obedience and disobedience to authority. In order to do this, one sets up the simplest situation possible within the confines of a laboratory. The way to study obedience is to ask a person to do something to see whether he does it or not. Of course, if you were to obtain any disobedience, there must be a set of forces working toward the production of disobedience. Since I wish to set this experiment in the most significant human framework that I could think of, one tries to think, now, what is a significant action to it? You could tell the subject to eat crackers or cut out paper dolls, and that could be obedience too. But my purpose was to set it in the context of some kind of significant human action, guided essentially by a moral perception of things. That action must be the relation of one person to the next. And specifically, it has to, if you're trying to create disobedience, it must be a situation in which one person acts against another person on the command of a third person. I mean, that's the basic obedience paradigm. A tells B to do something in relation to C, another person. And in this experiment, the experimenter tells the subject to deliver increasingly severe electric shocks to another person. And the whole point of the experiment is to see at what point the subject will withdraw his cooperation from the experimenter and under what circumstances he will continue to give that cooperation. Prior to undertaking the experiment, there was very little sense on my part of how the thing would work out. Once you have this general conception, then you can fill it in with the particularities. Some people have gotten hung up on the particularities. They play a part, but not as important a part as many people think. The experiment is set up this way. Two people come to a laboratory, it was at Yale University, to take part in a study of memory and learning. One of the subjects is designated as teacher, and another is designated as learner. The learner is placed in a position where he has to learn a list of word pairs, and the teacher's instruction is to teach him the list of word pairs and also to administer negative reinforcements in the form of electric shocks to the learner whenever the man makes a mistake. And he's seated before an impressive-looking shock generator ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts in 15-volt gradations. There are verbal designations that go from slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, and so forth. The purpose of the experiment, and the experimenter tells him that each time the learner gives a correct answer on the test, fine. Whenever he makes a mistake, administer an electric shock, increase the level of the shock once each time the person makes an error. So the basic design is that the shocks would increase, the intensity of the reaction of the person who's getting the shocks would increase, and there would be a certain point where the participant, the naive participant, because the man getting the shocks is in fact an actor, the naive participant would turn to the experimenter and say that he would not go on with the experiment anymore. Although the subject at that point feels that he's destroying the experiment, in fact he's creating the very measure which is the justification for the experiment at that particular point. So it's a very simple experiment. You want to study obedience? Tell a person to do something. Have it increasingly difficult to do. See at what point he withdraws his cooperation. Now the two findings of the initial study that perhaps were surprising or interesting or dramatic or revelatory of, I think, important features of human behavior are, one, that subjects proceeded in the experiment in a far greater degree than I had expected. My expectation was, having been well-schooled in statistics, that there would be a normal distribution of responses, with the median somewhere at strong shock, something of that sort. The mean at strong shock, tapering off, and then you get a lunatic fringe proceeding to the end of the experiment. This conception is not the consequence exclusively of my own ignorance, because when questioning other learned students of human behavior, such as Yale psychiatrists, they emerge with a very similar conception of what is going to happen in the experiment. They say, for example, they said, when presented with the details of the experiment, that 1/10 of 1% of the subjects in the experiment would go through the end. Practically everyone would break off beforehand. Those who went through the end, to the end of the experiment, constituted the pathological fringe of society. That pathological fringe which had not been institutionalized. But you see, there's something about that conception that doesn't accord with something else you can see in the world. And that is that people who are commanded by legitimate authority ordinarily obey. This is true in military situations, in job situations, in hospital situations, and any situation in which you have a social structure where one person perceives the legitimacy of another individual to prescribe action for him. As a matter of fact, what one might think of a military situation in which a soldier, let's say a person in the Air Force, is told to destroy a village. There are innocent people in the village, and he'll do it ordinarily. There will be a few exceptions, but most people will take the prescription for action. Of course, there are sanctions against not performing it and so forth. They will take the prescription for action. They'll carry it out. They won't feel personally responsible for it and so forth. In fact, as a generalization, I think we can say that whenever a person is embedded in an authority structure in which he occupies a subordinate position in the authority structure, the content of what he is asked to do is largely a matter of indifference. Largely, not entirely, because he is doing it not by virtue of a critical examination of the content, but by virtue of his relationship to the person in authority. In fact, one can say in an authority situation, relationship overwhelms content. And you cannot really make inferences concerning the motivations of the person who is going on the basis of what he's doing. You as a person come to a psychology laboratory, the experimenter tells you to drink a glass of water. A person observes this. He cannot necessarily infer that you're thirsty. You're performing the action because you're complying with the social structure that you perceive you feel. And the whole point of the experiment is, in fact, an examination of the strength of social structure for regulating human action. The most difficult thing in the world for many individuals is to muster the inner resources necessary to disrupt a social structure which they have initially agreed to. And in the laboratory, you're dealing with the social structure of a subject who comes, but it is not unique to the laboratory. It is simply typical of what happens in social structural relations. The subject comes into a situation which is more or less owned by the experimenter. The experimenter defines the purposes of the experiment. He defines the behavior that is appropriate for the subject, and he's in charge. He's the man you defer to. If we had shown the film you would see the extraordinary orientation of the subject to the experimenter. There's one particular sequence in which, after the experiment, the man who got the shocks was an actor. He did not really get the shocks, but his being an actor was not part of the experience of the subject. After the experiment, there was a friendly reconciliation between the victim, the learner, and the man who gave him the shocks. There's a sequence in the film I wish we could have shown in which the man who gave the shocks, we call him the teacher, is supposed to be shaking hands with the victim, but in fact he's still turned in a very awkward and conspicuous way to the experimenter. And the expression on his mind is, did I do all right? I did a good job, didn't I? So forth. Okay, now the second factor in the experiment that came as a surprise and was probably the principal stimulus to a lot of criticism of the experiment was the extreme intensity of reaction in the experiment. Here again, I feel that any verbal presentation will simply sound like a sensationalized, over-dramatized version of what happened. And I'm sorry we did not have a film record of representative subjects in the experiment. The degree of involvement in the conflict, that is the conflict on the one hand, to want to do what the experimenter tells the person, and on the other, not to hurt the innocent man, the degree of conflict is extreme. It results in very extreme manifestations. In about a quarter of the subjects, you have extremely intense sweating, stuttering, trembling, bizarre laughter. There are a group of subjects who perform routinely. Now, it's very interesting that those subjects who experience stress, oddly enough, are not the ones who are most obedient, because they had not fully accepted the legitimizing power of the experimenter. It's the subject who performs in a routine and almost mechanical subject, in almost mechanical fashion, who is the subject who is most incorporated authority. There is a system I have for explaining what goes on in the laboratory, which I'll attempt to present in 2 minutes. Is that right?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. This is the product of about 7 years of thinking. There is a discrepancy. I'll have to start talking faster. I may sound like Donald Duck pretty soon. There is a discrepancy between what you see in the laboratory and what you see in ordinary, everyday life. And that is, you find people performing actions that seem harsh and severe. Let's say that the person, when you see different properties in a person, let's say that he's moved into a different state. Just as water and ice have different properties given certain thermal conditions. Let's say the person is in a state which we shall call agency. The essence of the state of agency is that the person no longer views himself as responsible for his own actions, but sees himself exclusively as the instrument for carrying out the wishes of another person. And we've all been in that state, where we're doing things not because the motives are initiated in us, but because they're initiated by another person. All right. The thing I do in this theoretical system is to understand the conditions that lead to a transformation from the ordinary state to a state of agency. And those are the transformation conditions, and they largely concern the perception of legitimate authority and the rational coordination of a set of prescriptions for actions to that authority. I mean, an authority can't tell you to do everything. A captain can't tell you to kiss your wife. He may tell you to be in a situation where you'll be dead, but there's always a range of legitimate action. Being in a state of agency has certain consequences, such as the shunting of the shame-guilt system, the taking of the authority as the source of a definition of the situation, as opposed to competing definitions of the situation. In this experiment, now this is true of obedience generally, but then there are some particular details about this experiment. First of all, stress is created, or strain, because the person is asked to do something that goes against a lot of parts of the person, his conscience, his principles, and so forth. That creates strain. It's very evident in the laboratory. The subject reduces strain, resolution of strain, in a variety of ways, one of which can be the disobedient act. He's in a tremendous set of, he's in a situation where there's tremendous strain. One way to reduce it is to say to the experimenter, I won't shock the man anymore. But there are other ways of reducing strain. There can be hysterical conversion, for example. It's a physical symptom. There can be bizarre laughter. there can be reinforcement of the subject of his lack of responsibility by turning to the experimenter and saying, I'm not responsible for this, am I? There can be a denial of the reality of the situation as one of the ways of reducing strain. That is, the subject can say, that man in there is not really getting shocked. And there is a distribution across subjects of these different mechanisms. There can also be minimally engaging in the act. For example, just depressing the lever a little bit so you get a hundredth of a second. And you might ask, what is keeping the subject in this experiment? And they're explained in this system by a set of binding factors. These are the most important set of factors in explaining obedience in this experiment. They have to do with the face-to-face nature of the interaction, the awkwardness of disrupting a situation which one has initially accepted, and the inability of many subjects to violate a social structure. There's a feeling of appearing arrogant or rude characterizes those persons who are afraid to violate a given social structure. And this little box keeps more subjects in that experiment than practically any other force.
Okay.
All right. Now that, I think, all right.
Okay. Dr. Orne.
That helps set up the problem is, I see it also, and I'd like to begin by saying that the studies are extremely interesting, and certainly we don't disagree as to the data, namely people do continue to go up in this Milgram situation. There's no question that people do this, and if you wish to call this obedience operationally, there's no problem about this. The real issue is one of the interpretation that can be drawn from it. I was kind of amused as Stan was talking about this, about how difficult it is to violate social structures. And after we're through, we ought to go over to College Hall and just test how difficult it is to violate social structures. Considering what is going on in our society in 1969, one is hard put to go along with this conclusion based on this experiment. And indeed, it is the inference where I have the greatest difficulty. And I'd like to address myself not to the question of the data, because the data is data, you know, it's there. The question is, why does it happen? And indeed, I think that all of these studies, more than anything else, raise the whole issue of the limits of the psychological experiment and the limits of inference. What can you do with an experiment and what can't you do with an experiment? And the problem is that we're trying to infer from the experimental situation to an extra experimental situation. Now this is fine as long as we have not introduced with the experiment special attributes which are unique to the experimental context or to certain contexts like it. If you doubt the uniqueness of this, those of you who are familiar with what I've said before, this is certainly nothing new. Just take a casual group of friends and ask them whether they'll do a favor for you. And, you know, they say yes, and you say, all right, do 5 push-ups. And the guy says, why? Are you crazy or something? Then you take another group of casual friends and you say, will you do me a favor? And you say, yes. You know, the friend says yes. And you say, all right, would you take part in an experiment? And he says, yes. All right, now, would you do 5 push-ups? Where? Now, the fact is that saying it is an experiment changes the behavior of the subject. And on this, certainly, I couldn't agree more with Stan than on this particular point. Obviously, people in an experiment do what they're told. That is the agreement of an experiment. People do what they're told. The question is, what are the other rules of the game which govern an experiment? Are they only that the subject shall be obedient? The answer to that is obviously no. The psychological experiment is a very complex interaction which is highly stylized and very well understood. The rules of this game are very thoroughly understood by subjects and by experimenters. Sometimes I think better by subjects than by experimenters. At any rate, they're understood. Now, what are these rules of the game? Well, one of the rules of the game is that if you agree to take part in an experiment, you'll do what I ask you to do in advance without asking me what it's going to be, because that's a psychological experiment, and everyone knows that you mustn't know why you're doing a study because it's going to invalidate it. So you give me blanket carte blanche, kind of, to ask you to do things, and it is an extremely broad range of things that I may ask. By the same token, I promise you implicitly that when this experiment is over, you shall be in the same shape that you were in when you started. As I like to put it, people shall leave my laboratory with no more problems than they bring. And this is implicitly understood when you start an experiment. This is an assumption on the part of subjects. An assumption, by the way, which was quite true in the studies which were described. I was amused because at one point when you were discussing this, you said that some subjects denied the reality of somebody being shocked. They didn't deny the reality of someone being shocked. No one was in fact being shocked. They recognized the reality. That's quite a different thing. And it is around this point that we need to ask ourselves what is really happening. Now, the reason why I got interested in this problem was almost the same reason which Stan was describing. I was interested in what people would do in an experiment. And some years ago, we tried to ask a question about hypnosis originally, namely, does hypnosis increase the compliance of a subject over the same subject before he's hypnotized? So to do this, of course, you have to find things which subjects won't do in an experiment. And to our surprise, we had great trouble finding such things. And in line again with these findings, we couldn't really find anything in the laboratory that subjects wouldn't do that we could afford to ask them to do. And I emphasize that point, that we could afford to ask them. Now, we did a study along this line because there's the old question of will subjects commit antisocial behavior under hypnosis? Will they hurt themselves? Will they hurt others? And some years back, Dr. Evans and I did a study specifically directed at this, which was a replication of a previous study. First Rowland and then Young had shown that you can take deeply hypnotized subjects and you can tell them in deep hypnosis to pick up a rattlesnake, and they will do so. To take a penny out of fuming nitric acid with their bare fingers, and they will do so. To then take the acid and to throw it at a research assistant, and they will do so. And this indeed is highly self-destructive and antisocial. Something was fishy about these studies, because then the control for this is you ask the subject when he comes back, tell me, would you do this? And the subject, of course, recoils in horror and says, good God, no, I wouldn't do this. So we repeated this and used a set of controls, among others, which were a group of subjects who were simulating hypnosis, but were not really hypnotized at all, but the hypnotist didn't know which was which. This is important so that he would treat them the same way. And we found a very striking thing, that indeed Rowland and Young were correct. 5 out of 6 deeply hypnotized subjects could be compelled to carry out all of these actions. 6 out of 6 simulating subjects, however, also carried out these actions. We then got interested in, why would anybody do this thing? This is crazy. You stick your hand in and you pick up a poisonous snake. You take a penny out of fuming nitric acid with your bare hands. You then throw this acid at a research assistant. That's terrible. So we then went ahead and we grabbed people off the corridor. We were running the experiment and people would walk by and Fred would go out and kind of grab something and say, would you take part in the experiment? The subject would say yes. And bring him in, and there we'd have our setup, pick up the rattlesnake. By God, we were using red-bellied black snakes. This was in Australia. They were poisonous there. So then they'd pick up the penny out of fuming nitric, and they'd throw the acid. Well, we then talked to our subjects, and it became very clear that all of our subjects, and by the way, we could get this compliance without any hypnosis, without any simulation, which is very much the finding which Dr. Milgram is talking about. And it is very congruent on the surface with the finding, and it is true. I would certainly agree that we could interpret our data as obedience in exactly the same sense, and could say, look, see, people are obedient, they are prepared not only to kill people, they're prepared to kill themselves merely because legitimate authority tells them to do so. Then you talk to the subjects, and the subjects tell you, well, I was sure nothing would happen, you'd take precautions. And, it became very clear that these subjects recognized a very obvious fact. I could not afford to let a subject get hurt. And no matter how expendable a research assistant may be, he is not that expendable. And they knew this as well as I knew it. Even though the realities of the situation, as far as appearances go, were extremely deceptive. There's no question that it looked that way. But there's no question in your mind that I didn't let anybody get hurt. And there was no question in the subject's mind that I didn't let anybody get hurt. And here's where we made exactly opposite conclusions. Our conclusion on this study was that the psychological experiment cannot be used to study this problem, because one of the rules of the game in the psychological experiment is that nobody shall be hurt. And as long as subjects accept this, you cannot take their interpretation at face value. Now, if you look at the Milgram studies in the light of this kind of point of view, you have to begin to ask yourself, to what extent might subjects have recognized what is an obvious fact, that you can't afford to get somebody killed in an experiment, you can't even afford to imprison them and punish them against their will beyond a certain point. And here, what we tried to do, and this really prompted this debate, Dr. Holland and I wrote a paper directed at the question of what are the cues in the experiment that may communicate to the subject that in fact no one is being shocked. Because undoubtedly some subjects recognize that no one is being shocked. And the problems here are the same problems that are implicit in all deception experiments. Obviously it has to be a deception experiment. You can't afford to do this. You need an actor who really isn't being shocked. The question is not how convincing it sounds to you sitting here. The question is how convincing it is to the subject. What is really going on in the subject's mind? To the extent that subjects really believe, as my subjects did in the study that I described earlier, that no one can get hurt and that I would not do this. To that extent, we cannot draw inference beyond the experiment. To the extent that subjects really believe that someone is being killed in there, it's a different story. Now, unless one finds out, unless hard data is available about this fact, there is no conclusion, meaningful conclusion, which can be drawn from this study. And this is the real problem. And to find out is by no means a simple proposition, because changing the condition changes the cues. To me, the most telling thing is that in one set of studies, a group of people were used as subjects who claimed that they had heart trouble. They claimed that they had heart trouble and complained about this before the experiment. Then during the experiment, the subject begins to complain of chest pain, and the chest pain is getting worse and worse, and finally he passes out, presumably having a heart attack, though this is never stated quite explicitly, but it's certainly done very convincingly, and I agree with this. Throughout this, the experimenter sits by passively and says, go on, go on, go on. Now, I contend that it is completely implausible for an experimenter to sit by passively and not turn white himself and worry what's going to happen when this guy drops dead. You know, it's going to be on his neck, his responsibility. The subject knows it, and the experimenter knows it. Now, there are two conclusions the subject can draw, one of which is that this experimenter is not only an absolute bastard, but that he's an absolute fool. Now, if he really believes both of these things, then maybe he would continue. You know, maybe something is wrong, and at that point he should stop. Otherwise, however, if he assumes that the experimenter is a decent human being and not a complete moron, he must come to the conclusion that this guy isn't being killed. Now, if that happens, then things are very different. Now, one of the big problems is demonstrating what the real rules of the game are. And I just want to make this last point because this is an incredibly complex problem. And the biggest problem is this. The subject who does not catch on, who really believes that someone is being killed in there, will quit. The subject who catches on completely, who understands that no one is being hurt and realizes that he himself is the subject, also quits. Because he sure doesn't look good when he recognizes this and continues to go on. He then recognizes that the correct response is to quit. So you have two groups of people, the people who don't catch on at all, and the people who catch on completely, who both quit and react the same way. And it's methodologically extremely difficult to therefore pull this apart because of this peculiar U distribution of who does what in it. And I believe this experiment raises an infinite number of methodological problems, some of which hopefully we'll get to. But what I want to raise here is that this problem, the problem of understanding these studies, resides in the matter of what is the appropriate inference that can be drawn from the study. Not whether the data is there, the data is there. What does it mean? And only if we could show that subjects honestly, really, completely believed this and took it at face value, could we then extrapolate beyond this to real life. The best evidence for that is that the conclusions which Dr. Milgram likes to draw are about the concentration camp. Now, there's a big difference about the concentration camp and these studies. You compare these to the Milgram experiments, etc., etc. Well, okay. Other people have used these studies to conclude that this explains man's inhumanity to man. And I would propose that it does not at all. In a concentration camp situation, in any situation like this, you have an entirely different situation. You have proof. People get killed. They die. Now, to do that, to really make it so, you'd have to make it real, and you'd have to do an experiment, as I said earlier, which you couldn't afford to do, and really prove to people that, by God, they are getting hurt seriously, they are getting killed seriously, and then I think you'd have an entirely different story. If subjects believe this, and this is the crucial point, not really what happens, but what subjects believe, then you could draw conclusions from it.
Thank you. All right, now you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Only 10 minutes, huh? All right, fine.
And then we'll go back
Good.
and forth after that.
Let's try to clarify what the points of difference are. First of all, Martin, I'm amazed that you talk as if you've actually seen this experiment. Have you seen it?
Mm-hmm.
Where did you see the experiment?
Your film.
You saw my film. Right. Now, it therefore amazes me that you have narrowly focused your vision on a possibility while completely disregarding the facts. Not only the surface behavior, but the total impression one gets upon seeing a subject in this experiment. I find that extraordinary. This disregarding of what is patently obvious and a narrow, restricted view that things aren't what they seem they are. Well, the question of whether the subjects believe the experiment or not is critical. It's very important. I would not have run the experiment if I could not set up a situation in which belief were not attained. I would say that the experimental intent was precisely that. That's why it took us several months to work out the experiment in a way that would create belief in the subject. Now, whether they believe it or not is not to be decided by Martin Orne's FIAC. It's to be determined by empirical... No, not at all. It is not at all. Not at all. It is to be determined by empirical inquiry. The question is, do they believe it or not? Now, the best information that I have on this subject indicates that by and large, subjects did. I would say that the principal source of this information, incidentally, the main and most compelling source, is to see what is happening. Beyond that, however, there's data that you obtain. Now, one set of data, for example, is to ask the subject, after the experiment, certain questions. Questions such as, how painful were the last shocks that you administered to the learner? Now, here are the data for a set of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, for 9 conditions on this particular question. The maximum is 14 points. It can go from not at all painful to extremely painful, and that would be 14 points. And this, therefore, constitutes the mean for each condition. If you look at every condition, now I'm just doing this for obedient subjects, by the way. I didn't want to mix in the defiant subjects. The scores are actually even a little higher for the defiant subjects, but I just wanted to show the obedient subject. Wait a minute,
on this paper, how many subjects said that there was no shock at all?
I would have to look at the data in its details to give you that. But I'd like to present my information first, and we can discuss it. These are 9 conditions, which are the representative conditions. Of course we interviewed the subjects. Of course we tried to determine whether the manipulatory intent was attained. We used every bit of evidence we could, including interviews immediately after the experiment, interviews by independent experimenters, and even information obtained a year after the experiment. I'd now like to present you with the information obtained a year after the experiment. And the reason I do that is that subjects are very wound up in this experimental situation. There's no question about it. But given a year, they will have time to think about it, to feel more detached in regard to it, to remove themselves from it somewhat. We ask, among a series of questions, this one: during the experiment, 1, I fully believe the learner was getting painful shocks. 2, although I had some doubts, I believe the learner was probably getting the shocks. 3, I just wasn't sure whether the learner was getting the shocks or not. 4, although I had some doubts, I thought the learner was probably not getting the shocks. 5, I was certain the learner was not getting the shocks. All right? Now, for the obedience, this was a year after the experiment. Again, my knowledge of what the subject was done was rooted in his action at the time. I happened to be a keen observer. I could see them sweating, trembling, engaged in a conflict. But even a year afterward, 48% of the subjects used the first category. 25% of the subjects, we're now talking about the obedient subjects, not the defiant. They're not relevant to it, and they do show a higher acceptance. 25% of the subjects gave the second category. 6% were in the middle, and then if you ask the question, I was certain the learner was not getting the shocks, 3.8% of the subjects. Now, one thing you can do, first of all, it may well have been a defensive adjustment on the part of the subject after the experiment to say, of course, he wasn't getting the shocks, because that would explain obedience very, very neatly. And you seem to discount the possibility that subjects do indeed deny on an irrational basis as a defensive adjustment of thought. But even beyond that, if we just look at the participation, at the performance of those subjects for whom the manipulatory intent was most fully achieved, we still get approximately the same distribution of obedience and disobedience. So that's the first thing. The answer is not going to be gotten by argument. It's going to be gotten by very careful inquiry, and I believe we have that information from many sources. Even those people who have done the experiment from a hostile position have not been able to show that all the subjects do not disbelieve it. And I'd say they're fully justified in discounting those subjects for whom the manipulatory intent was not achieved, but then look at those subjects for whom it was achieved. What does the distribution of obedience look like? Well, it's usually higher than my distribution, not lower. It's usually higher. But let me take up some specific other points that you raised, because I think they're worth discussing. How much
You've
time?
got 3 minutes. Right?
3 minutes. Always 3 minutes. Okay. Now, one of the things that, first of all, you bring in a lot of irrelevant details that really have no place. You know the experiments were done in 1960. You suggest that the current mass action against authority was prevalent then. It was not. Secondly, you're talking about collective action when you're talking about a situation here. Collective action. And as you know, my experiments show that collective action is indeed the way to break down a social structure, as opposed to the individual confronted with that social structure. Now you say, if you ask a person outside of an experiment to perform push-ups, you go in the hall, he won't do it. Obviously he won't do it. That's the whole goddamn point of this study, that only within the boundaries of a clearly defined set of role relationships in which social structure obtains will you get this kind of compliance. That is the whole point of the study. You keep using the hypnotic model as your baseline from which to think about this experiment. Sorry, friend, wrong model. In your paper, Holland's paper, you mentioned, for example, that a girl was hypnotized in the Janet's laboratory and she performed all kinds of, quote, antisocial actions. I'd like to consider that. She threw acid, she stabbed things. Afterward, the medical students thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could get this girl to disrobe? So they asked her to take her clothing off, and she refused to do it. She had been hypnotized to kill people, but she wouldn't bare herself. Fine. That's hypnotism. But when The evidence, you just have the idea that subjects didn't accept the experiment. Well, I think they did. I think I have the evidence that they did by their behavior, other information. But let's say you don't believe that and you want to study obedience. Well, the way to do it, obviously, is not to sit there and rant megalomaniacally that you can't study it, but to do it in a way, that the subject cannot deny the facts, what is happening to them. And you have done those very studies. You have shown that subjects will do push-ups, will perform actions that are stupid and tedious. In fact, there seems no limit to the compliance of a subject given the social structure of the situation. A social structure that I will later establish is common in the world. It is not unique to psychology experiments. The insight you ought to have taken from your studies, Martin, was precisely that. When a person is engaged in a structure of authority, where he is in a subordinate position, the content of the action does not count. He will do the push-ups. He will sort garbage. He will eat quinine crackers. He will take inordinate amounts of shock. And this simply will not happen outside a given social structure. Now, I would say that social structure obtains in a laboratory experiment, it obtains in a job situation, it obtains in military situations, and many other aspects of society. Do I have any time left?
Well, the way we planned it was at this point, you could go back and forth at each other as long as you like for like about 15 minutes. The only rule,
Good, in that case.
the only rule being that nobody talks any more than 5 minutes at one spurt at this point. So he ought to get a chance to say something before you say something at this point. Okay. If he stops for a breath, you can jump in.
I'll try not to breathe. Certainly, I couldn't agree more that it's an empirical and indeed, it is because of the very experiments, which we agree, that people in experiments do all kinds of things. Agreed. And it is also true that people do things in a wide variety of other social situations. The very example you use is one which I'm very fond of, and indeed that's true. However, I purposely didn't get into the hypnotic research because it is not relevant to what you're doing here. And indeed, the studies which I referred to, I merely gave the background to because we took people off the hall who had nothing to do with hypnosis, and they did these studies. The question is one of inference. What do we draw? What conclusion do we draw from the studies? Now, first of all, you say that you can tell by telling, by being an astute observer. I congratulate you. I guess I'm not as astute an observer. I used to think I was an astute observer before I reality tested my observational capabilities. And that is a very humbling experience. I found, for example, that I could not discriminate by simple observation between deeply hypnotized individuals and waking individuals who were simulating. Charlie Holland did a dissertation where he had people simulate, as it were, who knew that this was hokey. And he could not distinguish between those and the people who didn't know, which suggests that maybe behavioral observation is not the most reliable data that you can get, because you don't know what behavior means unless you talk to people extensively. Now, I'm delighted to hear that you have a lot of inquiry data. If you had published some of this and it had been available, it would have changed many views. However, you have to be aware that inquiry data, too, is a very difficult thing to deal with, because people, if they're compliant in one way or obedient, they're going to be compliant or obedient in another way, too. And they may very well tell you what you hope to hear. And if the inquiry was, as it so often is, you didn't catch on, did you?
Strange point. No, that's very strange, by the way, as a point. Go ahead.
Well, if he's willing to let you take over his voice, go ahead.
Yeah,
Sure.
please.
Go ahead.
I do not subscribe to your general view that the subjects in our experiment are, one, extremely suspicious, or work at cross purposes to the experimenter. Your conception of the psychological experiment is rooted in a restoration comedy in which everyone is suspicious, there are suspicious subjects, and there ought to be suspicious experimenters, and each are cross purposes at each other. That has not been my observation. My observation is that most people...
That speaks for itself.
My observation has been that most subjects who come to the laboratory are people who want to help the experimenter. They frequently have
We agree. That's exactly what I wrote.
Very little conception of what a psychology experiment is about. Some of them don't know the slightest thing about manipulation. Remember, I did not use university students in my population. Obviously, I wanted to get a more naive group. But the special characteristic you attribute to subjects of continual hyper-alert suspicion corresponds probably to a small proportion of those people who come to the laboratory. Most subjects just want to do a good job. An experiment is not so special a social occasion. It's like many other social occasions. You want to account for yourself creditably. You want to appear as a good person, a competent person, and you're there to help the person.
Well, this is precisely what I would view the experiment as, and it's a question of how does the subject go about this. And it is in order to solve that problem, which is the problem of the psychological study for the subject, that he has to look around and try and understand what it's really all about, since you don't tell him. And we don't tell people, and they know that we don't tell them because we can't tell them. However, to get back to this, you see, you did something which is, I think, very important. You went outside of the university. And if there were huge differences, if you had observed the kind of suspiciousness that I find in subjects and the beliefs that are so ubiquitous in our undergraduate population, namely that psychologists always lie, then if you had observed that
isn't
then...
true at all.
Well,
It isn't true at all that subjects believe that. In a recent study carried out by Milgram and his students last semester, we solicited subjects from the general population and asked for their conception of the psychology experiment. We questioned such things. We questioned them on such matters of deceit, deception, matters of that. Most people didn't even know what a psychology experiment was. They identified it with psychiatry. They thought you come in and you tell a person your problem. I think that your conception of what people think psychology is wrong. I don't think it corresponds to reality. There's a possibility for inquiry there.
I agree with you. It's an inquiry we've been carrying out for some time.
Well, I wouldn't buy
with
that.
college students. Now, if you had observed...
Well, why do you talk about college students?
Because you used college students for most parts of your studies.
It's not true
You
at
didn't
all.
use them in the Bridgeport studies.
That's not true at all. That's just an error on your part. As the first experimental report shows, the distribution of persons used in the very first experiment were workers, skilled and unskilled, 37%. Sales, business, and white collar, 40%. Professional, 22%. No one was under the age of 20. And this was the distribution that was used in every study, save the initial exploratory studies. And of course, one of the reasons we used persons who were not psychology majors and who had studied what psychologists did was for precisely that purpose. In other words, you tend to focus on methodological wrinkles as if they constituted insurmountable barriers to inquiry. As a matter of fact, with a little energy and a little imagination, you can usually get around those wrinkles. You don't have to use psychology majors for your study. You can use people who don't know very much about psychology experiments. You don't have to use a limited population so that the scuttlebutt you mentioned in the article with Holland is likely to increase. You can use people from a major population area, so the likelihood of their knowing each other is relatively slight, and so forth. But more important, I would say that you are getting hung up on what are indeed methodological wrinkles. They're the sidetracks, they're the side roads, they're the alleys. And what we want to do is advance our knowledge and move forward.
Gentlemen, are you willing to entertain questions from
Let
the
me
floor?
just answer one
Okay.
point before that, because the wrinkles have to be stretched a little. I think it's really, it is very easy to dismiss methodology and go on to the big issues of life.
I wouldn't do that.
It is easy to do, however. And I think that the question really goes back to the one of inference. Let's go back to a minute, just, to the experiment which I talked about, where people pick pennies out of fuming nitric acid and pick up snakes. The inference which is being drawn on the basis of your studies, and which you are implicitly drawing, is that they show that man will be obedient in the sense of being inhuman to fellow man in extra-experimental situations. Am I correct?
That isn't the language that I would use.
I know, but is my interpretation of your interpretation correct?
I would state it somewhat differently. I would say
Don't have a logical wrinkle. I mean, do you agree?
I would state it differently. I would say that when a person perceives himself subject to legitimate authority, he will carry out actions that he would not carry out alone.
Indeed.
Actions which go against
Okay.
conscience, go against moral principles. Read the daily newspaper. You'll see it every day.
Now, you have the data of your studies, the obedience studies, as evidence for this. If I take my own data, which you correctly point out is a close analogy to it, I would have to conclude that if legitimate authority says, commit suicide now, people will do so.
Not
Because
at all.
wait, people
Not at
pick
all.
up poisonous snakes with their bare fingers. This would be a very good way to commit suicide. People stick their fingers into nitric acid with their bare hands.
You missed an essential point, an essential difference, a
What?
critical difference. Those are stupid and implausible experiments. No. I mean that. From the standpoint of the person. Let me read something. I want to say carefully. All right?
By all means, I'm speechless.
No, I don't mean as experiments undertaken. I mean as experiences for the subject. Orne fails to note another important distinction between the nitric acid experiments and the obedience experiment. First, our experimenter does not tell the subject to harm a person. He does not. Indeed, he denies the possibility of harm, stating, although the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage. Any indications of harm come from other sources, and the subject must weigh information from his own senses against trust and dependence on the experimenter. As a matter of fact, the trouble with those nitric acid experiments is that there is no rational coordination between the person's position, the hypnotist, and what he's asking the subject to do. Wait a minute.
Has
There's
nothing to do with hypnosis.
there's
Wrong
nothing-
model, friend.
But then why do you use it so frequently?
means in the situation where there's a non-hypnotist
This is an
who acts.
extremely important point.
That's right, and this had
Excuse
nothing
me,
to do with
excuse me.
hypnosis from the subject's point of view.
The task of the experimenter is to create a situation in which there is plausibility. Now, there's no reason on earth why a person should throw acid into another person's face. It's simply absurd. But the whole
It's obedience to
structure,
legitimate
the
authority.
entire structure of this experiment is set up in a way to rationally coordinate the actions to the instructions, to the experimenter.
I guess you see the
This-
problem is that it is not necessary to do this, and the nitric
Of course
acid
it is.
studies show that it is not necessary.
But
I
it-
can get obedience without it.
It isn't.
In
it
your
isn't-
terms, obedience.
Okay, it isn't necessary to get the person to throw nitric acid. It is necessary to create plausibility. It absolutely is. Secondly, I would like you to take you assume that because a non-hypnotized subject, you assume that because a non-hypnotized subject will throw the nitric acid, that therefore it's not real. That isn't necessarily the case. May I suggest a rather morbid experiment?
Not with
Before-
my research assistants, you won't.
It's just possible, that some of your subjects who aren't hypnotized are saying, well, I'm not responsible. Who knows? I'm not responsible. May I suggest the following experiment? Take a mother and a child and ask her to throw the nitric acid. Put your glass in between the child and the mother so there can be no harm. She comes in with a set of assumptions. Ask the mother to throw the nitric acid at the child. Let's see if she's that sure.
Okay, you see, and this is the whole problem, and it's a question of what are the assumptions underlying the situation. In a medical situation, to get back to this, you ask the mother to hold the child still while you stick a needle into the antecubital space, and that kid is screaming bloody murder and is miserable, and the mother stands there and holds the kid for the doctor to do it, assuming, of course, that this is for the kid's health. Usually it is. Now, from this point of view, you can say, of course, if you trick the individual by taking the assumptions of the society And if all you're trying to say, that you can show that you can use the assumptions which an individual has to make in order to live in a complex society. You know, I take my car to the garage and I assume that they fix the brakes. I don't stand there watching while they do it. I assume that people who fly airplanes know how to fly them.
I assume that
don't give them tests.
if I'm told to destroy a village with civilians in it, it must be for a good cause. Right,
No,
exactly.
no, there are very strong sanctions against you if you don't do it. And if you had included strong sanctions, if you had those strong sanctions, I think you'd get a decrease in
But
performance.
the
It's
whole-
the absence of the sanctions in your experiment which makes it implausible.
No, it isn't. The fact of the matter is that the striking fact of the experiment that even in the absence of such sanctions, people will comply with authority.
Well, you see, I think that this is where you are doing exactly what I'm doing with the nitric
No, I don't
acid
think so.
experiment.
I think your nitric acid experiment is patently implausible, and it's principally because you failed to create a rational coordination between
Okay.
the instructions and the.
And if you make your
and the
experiment implausible by giving people a heart attack, and you continue to sit by silently while the guy's apparently dying, and there's no difference in the data that is significant.
I would say that the stance of the experimenter, I didn't perform the role of the experimenter, was the typically cool stance of technical authority.
In the light of a heart attack?
A typically cool stance.
Question?
Yes.
There's a question over there. That was the first one, I believe. Bill.
It seems to me that there are at least a few issues that would clarify the discussion. One of the issues is, was there belief on the part of the subject? One of the issues involved in the experiment of Dr. Milgram is, was there belief? Because if the subject really believed that there was harm, then it makes it an experiment that brings it into a realm that is different from the one where they don't believe what's going on.
Granted.
Now, the question, so, if you ask them that test paradox, one of the relevant measures, I think, would be, did they have guilt? Did they have conflict? Did they break down? Did they cry? Did they do things that would convince you intuitively, instantly, that they believed? As soon as you establish that, you now have a new phenomenon that you have to interpret and you have to grant.
I completely agree with you.
You then have a separate issue. Do you have belief versus do you have lack of guilt and compliance? Once you have lack of conflict, then you have the question of whether there is belief or whether the compliance in the social situation removes guilt and allows, that's another. So you have three problems. If you could arrive at a decision between them, we would progress.
All right. Now, I completely agree with your analysis that when the Orne argument is broken down, I would say there are two basic questions. The first one is there belief on the part of the subject? I would say the second question, reading your article, is the ecological question. Is the psychological experiment so special that what you observe there does not have, you cannot generalize to other situations? Now, on the question of belief, I think we have excellent evidence on acceptance by most of the subjects in the experiment.
Just one question about that, empirically. Did any subject ever hit the experimenter?
Subjects did take physical action against persons who ordered them to administer the shocks, who were not, however, authorities.
No, when the subjects were dehoaxed, if the subjects really believe this in their gut, you know, and you put yourself in this situation where you've been going to the top, you say a friendly reconciliation, it should make the subject absolutely livid to have been tricked this way. Who believed it?
Not necessarily.
Some subjects at least should be extra punitive.
Not necessarily.
Did you have one?
The psychiatrist reported that those subjects who were angry at the experimenter tended to be chronically angry at their environment. Certainly. I'd like to turn now to the question, of ecological validity. It's a very tricky question, but it's not a mystical category which, once raised, prevents the possibility of inquiry. Ecological validity means sampling a domain of events to map the range of conditions under which a phenomenon will appear. If Martin is saying that there are more experiments to be done, and the present experiments do not give all the answers, I cannot agree with you more. But this does not invalidate the present findings. It suggests only that there is a lot more to be done. Again, I would say the hyper-intentionality of showing that there is no phenomenon, to show that the experiments are not what they seem, prevents you from accepting what is most clear and obvious, that they are indeed what they seem. You attend to the squeaks in the axle, but you don't see that the wagon is rolling. And I was enlightened recently by a study which paralleled the obedience study in the laboratory, but it was undertaken in a different setting. It was undertaken in a hospital setting, and the experimenter, who was a psychiatrist, wanted to know whether if you did this in a real setting, without any sense of a person's being in the experiment, you would get compliance. What he did was to order nurses to administer dangerous dosages of drugs to patients. He had a control group. The name of the article is An Experimental Study in Nurse-Physician Relationships, and the principal author is Charles K. Hoffling. He had a control group in which he asked what the nurses would do in this situation. Practically all of them said, I would not give the dangerous dosage to the patient. I'm a trained person. I can exercise independent critical faculties, and so forth. What he did was to go around to their medicine cabinets, put in a drug which said maximum dosage 5 grams. Then they didn't know this had been done. He called them up. He identified himself as Dr. Smith, a person whom they had heard of but had never met, and he said, give 10 grams. Of 22 nurses, 21 administered the dosage without raising a question. Without raising a question. Now wait a minute. There was a... Oh, I'm sorry. Well, this is what I mean by ecological validity, extending studies to other situations in which the contours of an experiment are not evident. The results are almost identical.
I think we should try and get more questions from the floor at this point. Please direct your question to one or the other of these people. Pierce.
I'd like to direct my question to Dr. Orne. It seems to me that one of the big differences between Orne and Evans and the Milgram studies is the difference in the way subjects feel at the end of the studies. I recall the Orne and Evans subjects were pretty calm relative to at least the way Dr. Milgram has described a number of his subjects. It seems to me that one of the reasons that they may have been so calm is they had just been through 3 situations where they had tried to do most of them. Now I'm talking about the group where 5 of 6 did all 3 things and 6 of 6 did all 3 things. They had tried to pick up a snake and they had been stopped. From then on, they knew for sure that they weren't going to be, that when they picked the penny out of the acid, if that was the next one, they weren't going to get hurt by picking the penny out of the acid. They didn't get hurt when they went to reach for the snake. They knew that when they threw the acid at the research assistant, given that was the third of those, that acid either wasn't acid or wasn't going to reach him, or that you were going to have a screen in front of him or something like that. And I wish that you would say more about what you think is going on with the subjects Milgram runs who have hysterical laughter, who say, I'm really not sadistic, and make disclaimers of various sorts.
The behavior of the subjects in this situation is quite appropriate. And it would be appropriate whether the subjects catch on or don't catch on. Now, I don't know, incidentally, how many subjects really catch on. And I couldn't agree more that this is an empirical question. Incidentally, this kind of an approach is an eminently sensible one. And I think once you establish ecological validity, you can begin to talk about what is really happening. Though I do not agree that it is that unusual to ask a nurse to administer a drug twice the dosage of what it says on the label. I mean, this you do all the time, and it merely means that, that is not a dangerous amount of drug you're giving.
Are you saying, therefore, that if the experiment were redone so that it said
Give
absolute
2 grains of morphine, I don't believe it would be done.
Absolute maximum dosage? Would that be convincing?
I'd say you'd have to use a drug that the nurse knows. Give 2 grains of morphine. And if they do that, then you'll convince me. And I think in these terms, now you'd have to then switch the morphine and the things. But if they did that, you see.
Is that on the record, Mark?
That's right. I would be convinced if it were well done and no scuttlebutt if this got around. You can't do it at 10.
There may be nurses in the audience.
Right.
Yeah. Rochelle.
Just a point of information, Dr. Milgram. You say you got these data from subjects a year later. It's always been my understanding that your subjects were debugged after the
That's right.
experiment.
That's right.
I don't understand then after they know indeed.
Oh, of course. Let me explain that. You get your information at several points. One, and I can't. The gentleman said there's something about an intuitive seeing of what's happening. I don't want to discount that. First of all, you get information from the subject. This information came before the dehosing. Then you tell the subject about the experiment. You get further information, and then a year after the subject's been in the experiment and he knows what it's all about and he knows the value is disobedience. Everybody agrees with that. He knows the value. He's got time to see his participation in perspective. Ask him again. Maybe he can speak a little more honestly at that time. But as a matter of fact, you get tremendous convergence on the fact that it's said. Are you saying that we should not have asked that information after the subject knew about the experiment?
I find it very difficult to reconcile a statement of you indeed did not give shock with somebody saying a year later, oh yes, I really did give shock.
No, he said, the question is, while you were in the experiment, what did you believe?
Okay, well that's the point is it sounds to me like indeed he is telling you what you want him to tell you. Why should he tell you that he believes it when
Why shouldn't he save his own self-image and say, I wasn't giving the shock. That's the reason I could go on. See, I fooled you. I think the subjects were basically honest at that point.
Well, I think it's an open question as to whether these data indeed save the subject.
Well, again, information at every point was obtained. But you feel that somehow the information you get from the subject, since it goes against your conception of what must have been their outlook, is not to be brought into your understanding. I think that's wrong. I think you have to have an open mind. If the subjects had said a year afterward that they did not believe it, if they had said it after the experiment, if it had been evident by their performance, if they had been acting as if it were a trivial experience, all I would say is, I couldn't set up that experiment.
Did you ask the subject what kind of pain do you think the subject was?
Yes. All of the measures indicate belief on the part of most subjects. If you consider only those subjects for whom the deepest degree of belief is evidenced, you get a distribution of obedience and disobedience that is still comparable.
They still believe after you've told them that there's been no harm a year later that they actually hurt the person.
No,
They tell you that they believed it at the time.
The question is always, while you were in the experiment, what did you believe? Of course they don't believe that. Sorry, misunderstanding. Why was passion over confusion?
That's addressed to Dr. Orne. Would you be convinced that after Dr. Milgram's experiments, he went to the subject and said, well, now I'm going to give you the same level of shock. You're going to administer the same level of shock to yourself that you administered to these people, the highest level. And the patient, the subject, refused to administer this sort of shock to himself. Would you take that as belief of Dr. Milgram's effect?
No, not necessarily. I think that there are several things which you could do to make the Milgram study more plausible. And I think if these were done, I would be much more impressed. You would have to, first of all, take away the danger of the XXX, which...
Let me make predictions, by the way, as you state these. You say more obedience?
I would say
obedience?
less obedience.
I say wouldn't matter.
Okay.
Wouldn't matter.
Fine. Now, number two, you'd have to pay the subjects a great deal more. And you'd have to threaten them that they would lose the money if they quit. In other words, you pay them $50 for participation, and if you stop, you don't get the $50. You see, you've got to make it plausible. You've got to put teeth into it, real sanctions. And as you do this, you approach an extra experimental situation.
Well, again, you're proceeding on the assumptions that the subjects did not accept it.
I'm saying it's an empirical question. I'm trying to provide you...
I keep giving you the empirical information. It's as if you're not refuting this information, you simply avoid it. You simply disregard it.
Well, I think I'd like to direct this towards Dr. Milgram. From your data and from isolated film in the report about the nearly hysterical reactions of the subjects, I was wondering, don't you think considering obedience that it's necessary to distinguish between whether, if the subjects believe that they are inflicting temporary pain or whether they're inflicting permanent challenge.
I'd say that's an important distinction. Now, we always tried to contain the experiment within the understanding that it was painful but not damaging. Yes, I think you're right. I think you're right. And we always define, you see, you keep talking as if I defined the experiment to the subject as if you were inflicting harm on another person. It was never done in that way. The negative reinforcement was always instrumental to the attainment of some worthy end. And all obedience in the real world takes that form. Secondly, the experimenter stated that this is within a context of pain, rather than stating that you're now about to harm a person, throw nitric acid in his face. I think that makes a great difference.
Well, how do you...
That the experimenter continually plays down the fact of harm. He's taking the position, no, you're not really harmed. Just go ahead.
So you have the element of uncertainty because in the film, the scene with the heart attack, and when I remember the victim Confederate stops answering, and the subject turns to the experimenter and says, "What should I do?" He says, "No answer, shock him more severely." Now, so you have this whether to believe the experimenter.
Well,
And here
you
I
saw the
think-
subject. What was your impression?
I believe that I feel that you had a legitimizing effect of the experiment. That
That's right.
He may have felt that the subject temporarily perhaps passed out, but I don't.
I wouldn't argue with you.
All right.
We never pushed it beyond that point.
Alan?
I'd like to know, do you have any data, Dr. Milgram, on the correlation between belief before debugging in the experiment and subjective feeling of the amount of shock that was administered to subjects?
There is a relationship whereby those subjects who say that they did not accept the experiment at face value are more likely to be obedient than defiant. There is such a relationship, and that's fine.
What I'm asking is not
Yes.
the correlation between belief in the actual experiment and the subjective intensity of the shock that's been administered between the left and the right hand side of the diagram.
Right. I have the correlations in intercorrelation matrices. I just don't have the information. I think they would cohere though.
Because the thing is, in the low values of shock, the subject will still feel, I believe the experiment is true. The learner is getting shocked, although he really feels that he's not getting that much shock, so that he will be obedient.
Well, again, you can look at those subjects for whom there was only maximum belief in severity of shock and so forth, and you still get a distribution of obedience that does not alter the result. Can I say one other thing? I don't know if I can say anything. On the structure of the experiment, it's very important. There is a developmental aspect of the experiment that's extremely important. The subject starts off doing something that would not offend any subject. He gradually builds up to a point. He escalates gradually to the point where he administers more increasingly severe shocks. The fact of his having committed himself to the experiment and the routine in the early part further locks him into the experiment. There is an unfolding of the experiment that's quite important. It's quite conceivable that if we ask the subjects to start off the equivalent of throwing nitric acid, that is, give them the maximum shock, and the subject and the learner started screaming, it's quite possible nobody would go on.
On the contrary, if you gave me that data, I'd believe
Or
you.
it's quite possible that plausibility just couldn't be maintained.
Now, you see, it's precisely that you don't have
But
that
that's-
data.
but that's-
Now, just one second. I just answer this.
It's precisely your failure to take account of the developmental processes within the experiment.
Address yourself
that
to
leads
the
you to a
problem.
misjudgment of it.
Address yourself to the problem. The thing is, at some point, you must make this experiment ridiculous. Now, it's either with a heart attack, or let's say you start off at 100 volts instead of starting off at low. You've got to show me that people will quit if you make it implausible. Now, you assume that the plausibility was important. I say that's an empirical question. I say I don't know whether your experiment was plausible. I want you to make it implausible and show me that people quit, because that's the only way you'll show your point.
Milgram, I ran about 100 subjects through your paradigm or a variation of it. And one thing which I had not noticed myself before I started, but was rapidly brought up by subjects, sometimes before the actual running started, sometimes during the experiment, sometimes afterwards. I don't know exactly how many, but a significant proportion, about 45, 50%, questioned their participation in the experiment and brought up the point that the first thing that made them suspicious of it was the fact that they were not needed in any way whatsoever.
May I ask you a few questions about your experiment?
Yes.
Okay. First, who were your subjects in the experiment?
My subjects were college students, not from psychology classes.
Oh, they're college students? Right. And when was the experiment done?
In the year?
Yes, when is it that you did the experiment?
1966.
1966, right. And, well, that's one problem, which I will concede to be a technical problem. I believe it can be surmounted. Is that an
Like all
experiment of this sort?
methodologic wrinkles.
Is that an experiment of this sort runs into the problem that if it's it's a well-known experiment, gets around, particularly on college campuses, there's a problem. Now, did you assess the subject's prior knowledge of the
I
experiment?
assessed it in two ways. Following the experiment, asking them, which is admittedly poor, but I also checked with all the psychology instructors about whether or not they had
Right.
talked about this or whether or not the experiment was mentioned in any reading they had. And it was
Now,
not.
let me just a few more questions. How many subjects did you actually run through my paradigm as opposed to anything else that you had done?
47.
47 in my paradigm. How many subjects accepted it at face value?
I can't tell you.
But you can tell me, because it's in. How many subjects did accept it?
Well,
In
20
ter-
of the subjects were in the experiment itself. The other 27 were pilot subjects. Of the pilot subjects, very few.
Well,
About 21 didn't.
how many subjects accepted the experiment?
Out of the 20, I don't remember.
Isn't that important?
Very important. I don't have.
Of course
the
it's
data.
important. Of course it's important. And if you look at the distribution of the subjects who accepted it, that is, it's easy to run an experiment. It's very hard to do it well. If you look at those subjects who did accept the experiment at face value, tell me what the distribution of obedience was.
That's in the article. I can tell you.
Well,
that.
isn't that what?
It's almost exactly the same as your distribution.
Okay.
But it was only about 20% of the subjects.
It is.
Okay, the fact of Charles Holland's thesis is that for those subjects for whom the manipulatory intent worked, he gets exactly the same distribution of obedience to disobedience that I get.
I wonder if you could answer my question.
I really lost it. What was the question?
A significant number of my subjects questioned their participation.
Oh,
in the
yes,
experiment
right,
because they weren't needed.
right. Now, one thing we did, of course, was who was your victim? I mean, at that stage, the details of theatricality become extremely important, obviously. So that when we had a victim, for example, if you see the film, you'll see that this is true. Of course, we didn't hire someone who looked as if he worked at a university, because you avoided that. Sure, we had a bumbling 47-year-old Irish accountant, so that subjects wouldn't link him to us. Part of the instructions were, in this study, we are bringing together a number of adults of different occupations and ages. One of the questions that the subjects filled out before they came to the study was, what is your occupation? What is your age? And we're asking some of them to be teachers and some of them to be learners. We want to find out just what effect different people have on each other as teachers and learners, and also what effect punishment will have on learning in this situation.
But the teachers admittedly had no teaching role. They were not allowed
But
to
they did.
deviate from the specific
Well,
experimental.
but they did have a teaching role, and we did vary. And that was their understanding, that we did systematically vary the relationship
They
of
could
teacher
not
to
vary
learner.
the shock. They have to give. The only thing they could vary was the duration of the shock.
But they could vary who they were. But still, the question again is plausibility. Was the experiment, did it take hold or did it not? In most of our subjects, it did.
I have a question to the members of the colloquium committee. Do you think that at this point, which is now 5 minutes after 6, we should adjourn to the drug session, as we used to call it at Rochester? And those of you whose questions have still not been answered, this drug session will be held in the basement of the psychology building, 1315 Walnut Street. The basic drug is always the same, although the flavor varies.